Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up in a world where everything wants to kill you? Where your first breath is a desperate gasp for survival, and your last might come before you even learn to hunt? Well, imagine being born as a Baryonyx in the Cretaceous period. Trust me, it wasn't exactly a five-star experience. Picture this. You crack through your shell sticky and vulnerable, only to discover that life has already dealt you the worst possible hand. You're not a massive T-Rex that can crush anything in its path. You're not a towering brachiosaurus that can simply step on threats. No, you're stuck somewhere in the middle, big enough to be seen as a threat by other predators, but small enough to be their next meal. Welcome to the nightmare that was being a Baryonyx. Now, before we dive into this prehistoric horror story, let me paint you the full picture of just how brutal life really was for these creatures. We're talking about an existence where every single day was a fight for survival, where your own family members might abandon you, and where the environment itself seemed designed to wipe you off the face of the earth. By the end of this video, you'll understand why being born as a Baryonyx was basically winning the worst lottery in natural history. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Despite all these challenges, some of them actually made it. Some survived long enough to become apex predators in their own right. So how did they do it? What did it take to overcome odds that would make a horror movie look like a children's bedtime story? Let's start at the very beginning, with the moment that would define the rest of your miserable existence. You emerge from your egg, and immediately the world hits you like a freight train. The air is thick and humid, filled with the stench of decay and danger. Your mother looms above you, but don't expect any warm, fuzzy parenting moments here. This isn't some Disney movie where Mama Bird feeds you worms and keeps you safe. No, your mother's primary concern is keeping herself alive, and if that means abandoning you to save her own hide, well, that's just natural selection at work. Your first few hours are critical, and most of your siblings won't make it past this point. The statistics are absolutely brutal. We're talking about survival rates that would make you grateful to be born as literally any other creature. Your egg tooth, that tiny projection that helped you break free, is now useless. Your legs are weak. Your coordination is non-existent. And your hunting instincts are basically a joke at this point. The forest floor is a death trap. Every rustling leaf could be a predator. Every shadow could be your last. And here's the kicker. You're hungry. Desperately. Painfully hungry. But catching food? That's a skill you haven't developed yet. You'll watch your mother demonstrate. See her lightning-fast strikes and precise movements. But translating that into your own success is like trying to perform brain surgery after watching a 5-minute YouTube tutorial. Speaking of your mother, let's talk about the parenting style that would make your worst helicopter parent look like a saint. Baryonyx mothers weren't exactly known for their nurturing qualities. Sure, they'd provide some protection from the biggest threats, but beyond that, you were essentially on your own. No participation trophies in the Cretaceous period, no second chances, no good effort pats on the back, you either figured it out or you became something else's dinner. The learning curve was absolutely insane. Imagine trying to master swimming, hunting, fighting, and territorial behavior, all while avoiding death from dozens of different predators. And we're not talking about cute little threats here. We're talking about creatures that could snap you in half without breaking a sweat. Crocodilians lurked in the water, ready to drag you under. Flying reptiles circled overhead like feathered nightmares. Other theropods saw you as either competition to eliminate or a convenient snack. But wait, it gets worse. Your own species wasn't even safe. Older Baryonyx individuals would view you as a threat to their territory, their food sources, their very existence. There was no species loyalty. No, we're all in this together mentality. It was pure, brutal competition from day one. Your own kind would attack you without hesitation if you wandered into the wrong area or showed any sign of weakness. The hunting aspect alone was a nightmare that would break most creatures. Baryonyx had this unique fishing technique that required incredible precision, timing, and patience. You had to learn to read water currents, predict fish movement patterns, and execute strikes with surgical accuracy. Miss your target, and you go hungry. Miss too many times, and you die. Simple as that. Your claws, which would eventually become your primary hunting tools, started out as clumsy, oversized appendages that seemed to get in your own way more than help you. Learning to coordinate these weapons while maintaining balance, swimming, and avoiding predators was like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on fire during an earthquake. The aquatic environment presented its own special brand of terror. Water that looked calm and safe could hide predators that made your worst nightmares seem pleasant. Crocodilians were masters of ambush, perfectly adapted to their environment in ways that made you look like a bumbling amateur. They'd been perfecting their killing techniques for millions of years before you even existed. And let's not forget about the competition for food sources. Every fish in the river wasn't just your potential meal, it was also being hunted by dozens of other predators. You weren't just competing with other Baryonyx, you were up against crocodiles, other fish-eating dinosaurs, and aquatic reptiles that had home field advantage. Imagine trying to get a job where every other applicant has been doing the work for decades, has better qualifications, and is actively trying to kill you during the interview process. The territorial battles were absolutely savage. Adult Baryonyx would fight with a ferocity that would make gladiatorial combat look like a friendly disagreement. We're talking about creatures armed with massive claws, powerful jaws, and zero mercy, engaging in life-or-death struggles over prime fishing spots. These weren't quick skirmishes. They were prolonged, brutal affairs that often ended with serious injuries or death. Your growth period was a constant race against time. You needed to get bigger and stronger as quickly as possible, but that required massive amounts of food that you were terrible at catching. It's like being told you need to become a professional athlete while only being allowed to eat what you can catch with your bare hands in a forest while blindfolded, and everything you're trying to catch can also kill you. The social dynamics were completely ruthless. There was no pack mentality, No cooperative hunting, no sharing of resources. Every Baryonyx was essentially a lone wolf, responsible for their own survival and willing to eliminate any competition. This meant that even as you grew stronger, you couldn't rely on others of your kind for support or assistance. You were truly alone in a world designed to kill you. Environmental disasters were another constant threat that could wipe out everything you'd worked for in an instant. Floods would reshape the landscape overnight, destroying familiar hunting grounds and forcing you to start over in unfamiliar territory. Droughts would concentrate prey and predators in smaller areas, increasing competition and danger exponentially. Climate shifts would alter entire ecosystems faster than you could adapt. The psychological toll of this existence was staggering. Constant vigilance, perpetual hunger, endless competition, and the ever-present threat of violent death would drive most modern creatures to complete mental breakdown. But Baryonyx had to maintain peak performance under these conditions day after day, year after year, with no breaks, no vacations, and no retirement plan. Your body was a walking contradiction that seemed designed to make survival as difficult as possible. Those massive claws that would eventually become your signature weapon, they started out as awkward, oversized tools that made simple tasks feel like trying to thread a needle while wearing boxing gloves. Walking was a challenge. Swimming was even worse. Every movement felt clumsy and uncoordinated, like your own anatomy was working against you. The hunting mechanics were absolutely brutal to master. You had to develop this incredibly specific technique where you'd wade into shallow water, remain perfectly still for extended periods, then execute lightning-fast strikes with surgical precision. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. The learning curve was steeper than Mount Everest, and failure meant starvation. Fish are surprisingly difficult targets when you're a massive, lumbering predator trying to be stealthy. They're fast, they're unpredictable, and they have the home field advantage in an environment where you're already struggling to maintain basic coordination. Your early hunting attempts were disasters that would make a comedy of errors look professional. Splash after splash, miss after miss, while your energy reserves depleted and your hunger grew more desperate. But here's where things get really twisted. Even when you finally started catching fish consistently, it wasn't enough. The caloric requirements for a growing Baryonyx were absolutely massive. You needed to catch dozens of fish per day just to maintain your energy levels, let alone grow stronger. It was like being stuck in a hamster wheel where running faster only made the wheel spin quicker. The seasonal changes turned your already difficult existence into a complete nightmare. During dry periods, water levels would drop, concentrating all the aquatic life into smaller areas. This sounds like it would make hunting easier, but it actually made everything worse. More prey in a smaller space also meant more predators competing for the same resources. The competition became absolutely savage. Imagine trying to fish in a crowded pond where every other fisherman is armed, desperate, and willing to kill you for your spot. That's what feeding time became during these seasonal bottlenecks. Adult crocodilians would dominate the best fishing spots through sheer intimidation and violence. Other theropods would patrol the shorelines, ready to steal your catch or make you their catch. You were basically fighting a war on multiple fronts just to get a decent meal. The flooding seasons brought their own special brand of horror. When the rains came, they came hard and fast, turning peaceful rivers into raging torrents that could sweep away everything in their path. Your carefully learned hunting grounds would disappear overnight, replaced by churning waters filled with debris, displaced predators, and zero visibility. Suddenly, you'd find yourself in completely unfamiliar territory with no idea where to find food or shelter. These floods were like hitting the reset button on your entire existence, except the game was rigged against you from the start. You'd have to relearn the geography, rediscover the best fishing spots, and reestablish your position in the local hierarchy, all while dealing with other displaced predators who were just as desperate and confused as you were. The aquatic environment itself was a masterclass in hostile design. Rivers and lakes weren't just bodies of water. They were complex ecosystems filled with creatures that had been perfecting their killing techniques for millions of years, before dinosaurs even existed. Crocodilians were the ultimate ambush predators, capable of launching themselves out of seemingly calm water with explosive force that would make your head spin. These weren't the relatively small crocodiles you might see in a modern zoo. We're talking about massive prehistoric killing machines that could easily overpower an adult Baryonyx, let alone a young one still learning the ropes. They lurked just beneath the surface, completely invisible until the moment they struck. By the time you realized the danger, it was usually too late to do anything but become a statistic. The psychological warfare was constant and exhausting. Every ripple on the water's surface could be a threat. Every shadow beneath the waves might hide a predator. You had to maintain perfect awareness at all times while also focusing on the incredibly demanding task of precision hunting. It's like trying to perform microsurgery while someone randomly fires gunshots near your head. Your own species provided zero comfort or support in this nightmare scenario. Older Baryonyx individuals weren't mentors or guides. They were additional threats that needed to be avoided at all costs. They'd already claimed the best territories through years of brutal competition, and they weren't about to share with some inexperienced youngster who couldn't even catch fish properly. These territorial disputes weren't civilized affairs with clear rules and boundaries. They were savage, no-holds-barred conflicts that often resulted in permanent injury or death. An established adult Baryonyx, defending their prime fishing spot, would attack with the fury of someone whose entire livelihood was being threatened, because that's exactly what was happening. The weapons involved in these conflicts were absolutely terrifying. Those massive claws weren't just for fishing. They were designed to inflict devastating damage on anything that got too close. We're talking about razor-sharp implements that could slice through muscle and bone with horrifying efficiency. A single, well-placed strike could end a territorial dispute permanently. The bite force of an adult Baryonyx was powerful enough to crush bones and tear through the toughest hide. Their jaws were designed for grabbing slippery fish, but they worked just as well on the flesh of competitors. These weren't warning bites or dominance displays. They were attempts to cause maximum damage in minimum time. Recovery from injuries in the Cretaceous period was a luxury that most creatures couldn't afford. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no pain medication. A serious wound meant you were operating at reduced capacity in an environment that demanded peak performance at all times. Infection was a constant threat that could turn a minor injury into a death sentence. The learning process for combat skills was particularly brutal because you couldn't practice on willing partners. Every fight was real, with real consequences, against opponents who were genuinely trying to kill you. There was no training montage, no gradual skill development, no safe environment to make mistakes and learn from them. Your first serious territorial challenge would come much sooner than you were ready for it. Some young, hungry Baryonyx would decide that your stretch of river looked appealing, and suddenly you'd find yourself in a life or death struggle that would determine whether you continued to exist or became a cautionary tale. The stress of constant vigilance was absolutely crushing. Modern animals in captivity develop psychological problems from much less pressure than what wild Baryonyx faced on a daily basis. You couldn't relax, couldn't let your guard down, couldn't take a day off from the exhausting process of staying alive. Every moment of rest was a potential moment of vulnerability that could be exploited by predators, competitors, or environmental hazards. Sleep became a strategic challenge rather than a biological necessity. Where could you rest without becoming easy prey? How long could you afford to be unconscious? What early warning systems could you rely on to detect approaching threats? These weren't idle concerns. They were life or death decisions that had to be made every single day. The metabolic demands of your growing body created a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break. You needed massive amounts of food to fuel your development, but obtaining that food required energy expenditure that often exceeded what you actually gained from eating. It was like running a business where every transaction cost more than it earned. The metabolic mathematics were absolutely ruthless. Your body demanded roughly 3 times more calories per day than you could reliably catch, creating an energy deficit that would slowly starve you to death even when you thought you were doing well. It's like being trapped in a biological pyramid scheme where the house always wins and you're always the sucker paying in. This caloric nightmare meant that even successful hunting days weren't enough. You could catch 5 fish in a morning, feel proud of your accomplishment, and still be operating at an energy loss that would gradually weaken you over time. Your body was essentially eating itself from the inside out, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic survival functions. The seasonal migrations added another layer of complexity that would make your head spin. Fish populations didn't stay conveniently located in your territory year-round. They moved with temperature changes, water levels, and breeding cycles that followed patterns you couldn't predict or understand. Your reliable food source would simply vanish overnight, leaving you scrambling to find new hunting grounds that were already occupied by better established predators. These migration patterns meant you were essentially starting over multiple times per year. Just when you'd finally figured out the local ecosystem, mapped out the best fishing spots, and established some semblance of routine, everything would change. Your carefully acquired knowledge became worthless, and you'd find yourself back at square one, fumbling around like a complete amateur. The water chemistry itself was working against you in ways that modern creatures never have to consider. Cretaceous rivers weren't the relatively clean waterways you might imagine. They were complex chemical cocktails filled with volcanic runoff, decaying organic matter, and mineral concentrations that could vary dramatically from season to season. These changes affected fish behavior in ways that would constantly throw off your hunting techniques. Acidic water from volcanic activity would make fish more aggressive and unpredictable. High mineral content would alter their swimming patterns. Algae blooms would reduce visibility to near zero, turning your precision hunting into blind guesswork. You were essentially trying to master a skill where the rules changed without warning multiple times per year. The reproductive pressures were another nightmare that started affecting you long before you were ready to deal with them. Male Baryonyx had to establish and defend territories not just for survival, but to attract potential mates. This meant your already difficult existence became exponentially more challenging as you matured. You weren't just fighting for food anymore. You were fighting for the right to continue your genetic line. Female Baryonyx weren't exactly looking for sensitive, caring partners either. They wanted mates who could demonstrate superior hunting skills, territorial control, and combat prowess. Your romantic prospects were directly tied to your ability to dominate other predators in violent confrontations. Dating in the Cretaceous was basically like entering a gladiatorial tournament where second place meant genetic extinction. The mating season transformed already aggressive creatures into absolutely savage killing machines. Hormonal changes would trigger territorial behavior so intense that normally rational predators would fight to the death over relatively minor disputes. The river systems would become war zones, where established hierarchies meant nothing, and everyone was a potential threat. These seasonal testosterone surges weren't just about increased aggression. They fundamentally altered hunting behavior, territorial awareness, and survival instincts. Males would take incredible risks to display their prowess, often abandoning successful hunting strategies for more dramatic but less effective techniques. It was like having your survival software corrupted by biological malware that prioritized showing off over staying alive. The communication challenges were absolutely staggering. Unlike pack hunters that developed complex social signals, Baryonyx were essentially mute when it came to meaningful interaction with their own species. You had to interpret subtle body language, territorial markings, and behavioral cues without any formal education in Baryonyx social dynamics. Misreading these signals could trigger violent confrontations that you weren't prepared to handle. Territory marking became a crucial survival skill that nobody bothered to teach you. You had to figure out the complex scent-based communication system while avoiding the territories of creatures who would kill you for trespassing. It was like learning a foreign language where making grammatical errors could result in immediate death sentences. The scent markers left by other baryonyx told detailed stories about their size, health, recent hunting success, and territorial claims. Reading these chemical messages accurately was essential for navigation, but the learning curve was steep and mistakes were fatal. Wander into the wrong area because you misinterpreted a scent marker, and you'd find yourself facing an opponent who was bigger, stronger, and infinitely more experienced than you were. Your own scent production was another biological system that seemed designed to work against you. Young Baryonyx produced chemical signatures that basically advertised their inexperience and vulnerability to every predator in the area. You were walking around with a biological neon sign that screamed easy target to anything with a functioning nose. The dental maintenance requirements were a constant source of stress that modern creatures never have to consider. Your teeth weren't just tools, they were your entire livelihood, and they required constant care to remain functional. Cracked or damaged teeth meant hunting became exponentially more difficult. But dental hygiene in the Cretaceous involved techniques that would make a medieval dentist look sophisticated. You had to learn to use specific types of vegetation, rough surfaces, and even other bones to keep your teeth sharp and clean. This maintenance routine had to be balanced against the constant need to hunt, defend territory, and avoid predators. It was like trying to perform routine car maintenance while driving through a war zone at high speed. Tooth replacement was an ongoing biological process that created periods of vulnerability where your hunting effectiveness was significantly reduced. Growing new teeth took energy and time you couldn't afford to spare, but ignoring dental health meant slow starvation as your ability to catch and process food deteriorated. The eye development challenges were particularly cruel because vision was absolutely critical for successful fishing. Young Baryonyx had to develop the specific visual acuity needed to track fast-moving fish through murky water, while simultaneously watching for threats from above, below, and all sides. Your eyes were essentially trying to perform the functions of a high-tech targeting system while running on prehistoric biological hardware. Depth perception underwater was a skill that required months of practice to develop properly. The refraction of light through water created optical illusions that would cause you to consistently miss your targets by embarrassing margins. Every failed strike wasted energy you couldn't afford to lose and potentially alerted other predators to your location. The binocular vision needed for accurate strikes had to be developed through trial and error in an environment where errors could be fatal. You were essentially learning to be a sniper while people were shooting back. Except the people were massive prehistoric predators, and missing meant you went hungry for another day. Color discrimination became crucial for identifying healthy fish versus diseased ones, distinguishing between different species with varying nutritional values, and spotting camouflage threats in the aquatic environment. Your visual cortex had to develop incredibly sophisticated processing capabilities just to handle basic survival tasks. Night vision presented its own special challenges because many of the most dangerous predators were most active during low-light conditions. Your eyes had to adapt to function effectively across a wide range of lighting conditions while maintaining the precision necessary for successful hunting. It was like trying to be simultaneously optimized for microscopic detail work and long-distance reconnaissance. The hearing development was equally challenging because the aquatic environment created complex acoustic conditions that could mask approaching threats or distort important environmental cues. Sound traveled differently through water than air, creating false echoes and directional confusion that could send you swimming directly toward danger while thinking you were fleeing from it. Underwater hearing required completely different processing techniques than terrestrial sound detection. The same splash that indicated a fish breaking the surface could also signal an approaching crocodilian launching an attack. Your auditory system had to develop the ability to distinguish between dozens of different water-based sounds while filtering out irrelevant background noise. The vocal communication limitations meant you couldn't call for help, warn others of danger, or coordinate any kind of group response to threats. You were essentially operating as a completely isolated unit in an environment where teamwork could have significantly improved survival odds. Every challenge had to be faced alone, every problem solved through individual effort. Respiratory challenges in the aquatic environment were constantly threatening to compromise your hunting effectiveness. Extended periods of breath holding were necessary for successful fishing, but your lung capacity and oxygen efficiency had to be developed through practice that often pushed you to the edge of unconsciousness. Learning to hold your breath while remaining alert for threats was like trying to meditate during a firefight. The diving physiology required for deep water hunting put enormous stress on your cardiovascular system. Your heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen distribution had to adapt to conditions that would kill most terrestrial creatures. Every deep hunting expedition was essentially a controlled near-death experience that could easily become an uncontrolled actual death experience. Surface breathing between hunting attempts left you vulnerable to aerial predators that specialized in attacking creatures during these moments of respiratory necessity. You had to time your breathing cycles to minimize exposure while ensuring adequate oxygen levels for the next hunting dive. It was like playing a deadly game of timing where miscalculations were fatal. The thermoregulation challenges in aquatic environments were absolutely brutal. Water conducted heat away from your body much more efficiently than air, meaning extended hunting sessions could lead to dangerous drops in core body temperature. Hypothermia wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a performance-killing condition that made precise movements impossible and reaction times fatally slow. Warming up after cold water hunting required basking behaviors that left you exposed and vulnerable on shorelines where terrestrial predators could easily spot and attack you. You were trapped between the thermal demands of your biology and the security requirements of your environment. Every solution created new problems that needed solving. The seasonal temperature variations meant your thermoregulation strategies had to be constantly adjusted throughout the year. Techniques that worked during warm periods could be completely ineffective or even dangerous during cooler seasons. Your body was essentially running on constantly changing software that you had to debug through life-threatening trial and error. The social isolation was psychologically devastating in ways that are difficult for modern creatures to comprehend. Humans and most other intelligent species rely on social interaction for mental health and emotional stability. Baryonyx were condemned to lives of complete solitary existence where every member of their own species was viewed as a potential threat rather than a source of companionship or support. This isolation meant there was no knowledge transfer between generations, no learning from the experiences of others, no collective problem solving or innovation. Every Baryonyx had to independently discover the same survival techniques through personal trial and error, leading to massive inefficiencies and unnecessary deaths from the problems that had already been solved by others. The loneliness factor created stress responses that compromised immune function, reduced cognitive performance, and increased risk-taking behaviors. Your mental health was deteriorating even as you struggled to master the physical challenges of survival. It was like trying to maintain peak performance while suffering from chronic depression caused by evolutionary design flaws. The lack of play behavior or recreational activities meant your entire existence was focused on immediate survival needs without any opportunity for stress relief or mental stimulation beyond the constant pressure of staying alive. Modern animals engage in play to develop skills, build social bonds, and maintain psychological health. Baryonyx had none of these outlets. The neurological development required for complex hunting behaviors had to occur without any guidance or instruction from experienced adults. Your brain was essentially trying to develop advanced predatory software through random experimentation while running on hardware that was still under construction. The cognitive load was absolutely staggering. Memory formation and retention became critical survival skills because you had to independently catalog vast amounts of information about territorial boundaries, seasonal patterns, individual threat assessments, and environmental changes. Your brain was functioning as a biological computer that had to maintain perfect records while operating under constant stress and without any backup systems. The decision-making processes required for survival were incredibly complex because every choice had potentially fatal consequences. Should you pursue that fish, even though it might take you into another predator's territory? Should you abandon a proven hunting ground when competition increases? Should you fight or flee when confronted by a territorial rival? These weren't casual decisions. They were life or death calculations that had to be made multiple times per day. Pattern recognition skills had to develop rapidly because survival depended on your ability to identify subtle environmental changes that indicated danger, opportunity, or seasonal shifts. Your brain was constantly processing massive amounts of sensory data while trying to extract meaningful patterns that could inform future decisions. It was like trying to be a biological weather prediction system while dodging lightning strikes. The stress hormone production in young Baryonyx was so elevated that it actually interfered with normal development processes. Chronic cortisol elevation suppressed growth, compromised immune function, and impaired cognitive development. Your body's stress response system was essentially poisoning you, even as it tried to keep you alive in impossible circumstances. Sleep deprivation became another layer of hell in your already impossible existence. The constant need for vigilance meant you could never achieve the deep, restorative sleep that your developing brain and body desperately require. You catch brief moments of unconsciousness while remaining partially alert, like a broken security system that never fully shut down, but never worked properly either. The micro-sleeps you managed were haunted by the sounds of potential threats. Every splash, every rustling leaf, every distant call would jolt you back to full alertness, flooding your system with stress hormones that made returning to sleep nearly impossible. Your nervous system was stuck in permanent overdrive, burning through energy reserves you couldn't afford to waste. Finding safe sleeping locations was a strategic nightmare that consumed hours of precious daylight. You needed spots that offered protection from multiple angles while providing quick escape routes if discovered. But the best hiding places were usually already claimed by other predators who had no intention of sharing their real estate with inexperienced competition. The circadian rhythm disruptions caused by irregular sleep patterns created a cascade of biological problems that compounded your survival difficulties. Your hormone production became erratic, your immune system weakened, and your cognitive function deteriorated precisely when you needed peak performance to stay alive. Dream states, when they occasionally occurred, became twisted psychological torture chambers where your subconscious mind replayed every near-death experience and projected future scenarios that were somehow even worse than your waking reality. Your brain couldn't find peace even in unconsciousness, turning what should have been recovery time into additional stress exposure. The digestive challenges were absolutely savage and seemed designed by some malevolent force that wanted to make eating as difficult and dangerous as possible. Your stomach acid wasn't strong enough to handle the bones and scales that came with your fish-based diet, leading to frequent digestive blockages that could be fatal if not resolved quickly. Regurgitation became a necessary survival skill, but it was also incredibly wasteful of precious calories and left you vulnerable during the process. Imagine having to voluntarily vomit up your hard-earned meal while remaining alert for predators who might be attracted by the sound and smell of your digestive distress. The gut bacteria required for proper digestion had to be acquired through trial and error, often by consuming partially decomposed material that carried significant risks of food poisoning. Your digestive system was essentially experimenting with different bacterial cultures while you slowly starved, hoping to stumble upon combinations that wouldn't kill you. Intestinal parasites were an inevitable part of your existence, creating internal competition for the nutrients you desperately needed. These microscopic invaders would establish colonies in your digestive tract, stealing calories and compromising your immune system, while you remained completely unaware of their presence. The fiber requirements for proper digestion meant you had to supplement your fish diet with vegetation that was often toxic, nutritionally worthless, or defended by creatures that viewed you as a threat. Finding safe plant matter became another time-consuming survival task that diverted attention from hunting and territorial defense. Seasonal dietary shifts forced your digestive system to constantly readjust to different food sources with varying nutritional profiles and processing requirements. Your gut bacteria colonies had to evolve in real time to handle these changes, often leaving you malnourished during transition periods when nothing was being properly digested. The calcium absorption problems created by your aquatic lifestyle meant your bone density was constantly compromised, making you more susceptible to fractures during the inevitable combat encounters. Your skeleton was essentially weakening even as you grew larger, creating structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited by more experienced fighters. Vitamin deficiencies became chronic problems that affected everything from wound healing to neural development. The limited dietary options available to young Baryonyx meant you were operating in a state of perpetual malnutrition that compromised every biological system. Simultaneously, the iron requirements for maintaining adequate blood oxygen levels were enormous, but the bioavailability of iron from fish-based diets was surprisingly poor. You were essentially slowly developing anemia while engaging in activities that demanded peak cardiovascular performance. It was like trying to run a marathon while gradually suffocating. Protein synthesis became incredibly inefficient due to missing amino acids that weren't available in your restricted diet. Your muscle development was constantly hampered by nutritional gaps that prevented optimal tissue repair and growth, leaving you perpetually behind the physical development curve. The water quality in Cretaceous river systems was a constantly changing chemical nightmare that would make modern pollution look like a minor inconvenience. Volcanic runoff created acidic conditions that burned your respiratory tissues and skin. Heavy metal concentrations from geological processes slowly poisoned your nervous system while you remained completely unaware of the contamination. Algae blooms produced toxins that caused neurological symptoms ranging from disorientation to paralysis. Swimming through these poisonous water masses was like navigating through clouds of biological warfare agents that attacked your brain and nervous system with every breath and every drop that touched your skin. The bacterial loads in stagnant water areas were astronomical, creating infection risks that could turn minor cuts into life-threatening sepsis. Your immune system was constantly fighting off waterborne pathogens while also trying to handle the normal stresses of growth and development. Every hunting expedition exposed you to new varieties of potentially fatal microorganisms. Fungal infections flourished in the warm, humid conditions, attacking your respiratory system, skin, and even your eggs if you lived long enough to reproduce. These fungal colonies would establish themselves in your tissues and slowly consume you from the inside out while compromising your ability to hunt and defend yourself. The pH fluctuations caused by seasonal changes created chemical burns on your sensitive gill tissues and nasal passages. Your respiratory system was essentially being corroded by the very water you needed to breathe while hunting. It was like trying to perform precision work while being slowly dissolved by acid. Chemical interactions between different water sources created toxic combinations that couldn't be detected until you were already poisoned. Rivers dissolved minerals that became lethal when combined with your body that seemed safe based on visual inspection could be carrying chemistry or other environmental factors. The bioaccumulation of toxins in fish populations meant your food sources were increasingly contaminated as you moved up the food chain. Every successful hunt was slowly poisoning you with concentrated chemicals that your body couldn't process or eliminate effectively. Your prey was essentially a delivery system for environmental toxins. The seasonal flooding patterns created massive disruptions that went far beyond simple territorial displacement. These floods would mix water systems that had been chemically isolated, creating new toxic combinations while simultaneously concentrating pollutants in ways that turned previously safe areas into death traps. Sediment loads during flood periods would bury familiar landmarks and completely alter the underwater topography you'd spent months learning to navigate. Your mental maps became worthless overnight, leaving you fumbling around in an alien landscape while competing with other displaced predators for limited resources. The debris carried by floodwaters created physical hazards that could cause injuries ranging from minor cuts to impalement by waterlogged tree branches. Swimming through flood zones was like navigating through an underwater obstacle course designed by someone who actively wanted you to die in the most inconvenient way possible. Decomposing organic matter carried by floods created oxygen dead zones where fish couldn't survive and hunting became impossible. These biological deserts could persist for weeks or months, forcing you to abandon proven hunting grounds and venture into unfamiliar territories controlled by established predators. The disease outbreaks that followed major floods were catastrophic events that could wipe out entire regional populations. Stagnant water pools became breeding grounds for pathogens that spread through water systems faster than you could flee from them. Epidemic diseases turned survival from an individual challenge into a regional extinction event. Temperature stratification in flood-altered water systems created thermal barriers that made diving hunting nearly impossible. The water column would separate into distinct temperature layers with such sharp boundaries that crossing them caused physiological shock that could trigger unconsciousness underwater. The noise pollution created by rushing floodwaters made acoustic hunting completely impossible while simultaneously masking the approach of predators. You were essentially rendered deaf in an environment where sound detection was crucial for both finding food and avoiding death. The sensory deprivation was absolutely maddening. Recovery periods following flood events stretched on for months, while ecosystems slowly stabilized and fish populations gradually returned to normal distributions. These Extended periods of resource scarcity created intense competition that often resulted in territorial wars lasting entire seasons. The psychological trauma of surviving major floods created lasting behavioral changes that often made future survival more difficult. Flood survivors often developed hypervigilance disorders that caused them to waste energy on false alarms while becoming paradoxically less responsive to actual threats. Territorial displacement during floods forced young Baryonyx into regions where they had no knowledge of local dangers, established hierarchies, or resource locations. You'd find yourself wandering through unfamiliar landscapes where every decision was potentially fatal because you lacked the environmental knowledge that older residents took for granted. The mate selection pressures were absolutely insane and seemed designed to eliminate genetic diversity rather than promote it. Female Baryonyx were incredibly selective, rejecting potential mates based on criteria that had little correlation with actual survival ability or genetic fitness. It was like a dating system designed by committee, where everyone had different and contradictory preferences now. Courtship displays required enormous energy investments that could leave males weakened and vulnerable during critical survival periods. You had to essentially choose between maintaining peak physical condition for survival or depleting your reserves to impress potential mates who might reject you anyway. The biological mathematics were absolutely brutal. The timing requirements for successful mating were incredibly narrow, creating windows of opportunity that might only occur once every few years. Miss your chance due to injury, territorial disputes, or simple bad luck, and you might never get another opportunity to pass on your genetic material. Sperm production demands created additional nutritional pressures that had to be balanced against normal growth and survival needs. Your body was essentially trying to run 3 different biological programs simultaneously while operating on insufficient resources to properly support any of them. The territorial requirements for attracting mates were enormous, forcing males to defend areas much larger than what they actually needed for personal survival. This territorial expansion brought you into conflict with multiple established predators, simultaneously while stretching your defensive capabilities beyond sustainable limits. Competition between males during mating season transformed already dangerous environments into absolute war zones, where rational behavior was abandoned in favor of increasingly risky displays of dominance. The testosterone-fueled aggression made normally cautious predators attempt suicidal attacks against superior opponents. Female mate evaluation periods were extended processes that required males to maintain peak performance over weeks or months while also defending territory and hunting for survival. It was like being forced to audition for a job while simultaneously working 3 other jobs and fighting off people trying to kill you. The post-mating abandonment meant successful reproduction provided no ongoing support for either parent or offspring. You were essentially breeding into a system designed to maximize offspring mortality while providing minimal parental investment. It was reproductive suicide disguised as biological success. The genetic bottlenecks created by selective mating preferences meant the overall population was becoming increasingly inbred, reducing disease resistance and adaptability while making future generations even more vulnerable to environmental pressures. The energy costs of reproductive behavior were so enormous that successful breeding often shortened lifespan significantly, creating an evolutionary trap where reproductive success was inversely correlated with individual survival. You could have babies or live longer, but not both. The hormonal disruptions caused by mating season affected hunting ability, territorial awareness, and threat assessment for months after breeding attempts, regardless of whether they were successful. Your brain chemistry was essentially hijacked by reproductive imperatives that compromised survival decision-making. The infant mortality rates were so astronomical that successful reproduction was essentially a numbers game, requiring multiple breeding attempts over many seasons. The statistical reality was that most of your offspring would die before reaching independence, making the entire reproductive investment seem futile. Nest site selection was a strategic nightmare because optimal locations for egg incubation were usually also optimal locations for predator feeding. You had to choose between giving your eggs the best chance of proper development or hiding them from creatures that viewed them as convenient protein sources. The incubation period required constant vigilance over eggs that couldn't be moved or defended effectively. Parent Baryonyx became sitting ducks during these critical weeks, unable to hunt effectively while remaining vulnerable to attacks from predators who had learned to target nesting sites. Temperature regulation for developing eggs was incredibly difficult in environments where ambient conditions fluctuated wildly. Too hot and the embryos would cook inside their shells. Too cold and development would halt, leading to death from developmental arrest. The margins for error were microscopic. The hatching process was a synchronized nightmare where multiple vulnerable offspring emerged simultaneously, creating a brief window of maximum vulnerability when predators could eliminate entire clutches with minimal effort. It was like hosting a buffet dinner for everything that wanted to eat your children. Sibling competition began immediately after hatching, with stronger offspring often killing or severely injuring their weaker siblings. Your parental investment was essentially funding a gladiatorial tournament where only the most aggressive offspring had any chance of survival. The post-hatching dispersal period was when most offspring mortality occurred, as inexperienced juveniles wandered into territories controlled by predators who viewed them as easy meals. The transition from parental protection to independent survival was essentially a death march disguised as natural development. The learning period for essential survival skills was compressed into a time frame that was inadequate for proper skill development. Young Baryonyx had to master complex hunting techniques, territorial behavior, and threat assessment faster than their neurological development could support. It was like trying to teach calculus to kindergartners while they were also learning to walk. The social abandonment that followed independence meant young Baryonyx lost access to the limited protection and guidance their parents had provided. You were essentially expelled from the only safety net you'd ever known and forced to compete immediately with creatures who had years of experience in an environment you barely understood. The survival statistics were absolutely horrific, with mortality rates approaching 90% during the first year of independent life. Being born as a Baryonyx was essentially winning a lottery where the prize was the opportunity to probably die in an extremely unpleasant way before your first birthday. But somehow, against all odds and logic, a few individuals managed to navigate this biological obstacle course successfully. They developed the skills, claimed the territories, and eventually became the apex predators that would terrorize the next generation of hapless hatchlings trying to survive in the same impossible conditions. The success stories were rare enough to be almost mythical, but they proved that survival was theoretically possible for creatures tough enough, smart enough, and lucky enough to beat odds that would make winning the modern lottery look like a sure thing. These survivors became the stuff of Cretaceous legends. If Cretaceous creatures had been capable of telling stories about their heroes, the evolutionary pressure was so intense that it created a feedback loop where only the most exceptional individuals could survive to reproduce, theoretically improving the species over time while simultaneously ensuring that the vast majority of each generation would die horribly before contributing anything to the gene pool. The biological arms race created by these survival pressures meant each generation faced slightly different but equally impossible challenges. As prey species evolved better defenses and competing predators developed more effective hunting strategies. Success in one generation provided no guarantee that the same techniques would work for the next. The environmental changes occurring during the Cretaceous period meant survival strategies had to constantly evolve to match shifting ecological conditions. What worked during stable periods became completely ineffective during times of climate change, volcanic activity, or major geological shifts. Adaptability became more important than raw physical prowess. The sheer randomness of survival outcomes meant that individual merit was often less important than pure chance. The most skilled hunter could be eliminated by a single moment of bad luck, while mediocre individuals sometimes survived through fortunate circumstances that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities. But for those few who managed to beat the odds and establish themselves as successful adult Baryonyx, the reward was the opportunity to inflict the same impossible challenges on the next generation while enjoying a brief period of dominance before age and competition inevitably caught up with them. The cycle continued endlessly, with each generation facing the same brutal selection pressures that had eliminated most of their predecessors. Being born as a Baryonyx meant entering a biological lottery where the house always won and the players always paid with their lives. Yet somehow the species persisted through sheer numbers and the occasional individual who managed to thread the needle of survival long enough to reproduce. These rare success stories kept the evolutionary experiment running while serving as inspiration for the countless failures who would never live long enough to appreciate the magnitude of their achievements. The legacy of surviving Cretaceous childhood as a Baryonyx was earning the right to participate in an adult existence that was only marginally less dangerous and significantly more complex than the juvenile nightmare you'd somehow managed to escape. The territorial establishment phase was where your nightmare existence reached new levels of sophisticated torture. You'd survived the initial gauntlet of childhood, learned to catch fish with something approaching competence, and now faced the ultimate challenge, claiming a piece of real estate that other creatures had already decided belonged to them. This wasn't some friendly neighborhood dispute over property lines. This was biological warfare, where the weapons were razor-sharp claws and bone-crushing jaws. Finding unclaimed territory in the Cretaceous was like trying to find an empty parking space at the mall during Christmas shopping season, except the other drivers were actively trying to kill you, and the parking spaces were defended by creatures who'd rather die than give up their spots. Every decent fishing location was already occupied by established predators who'd invested years of blood, sweat, and violence into claiming their domains. The reconnaissance phase alone was absolutely exhausting. You had to scout potential territories while avoiding detection by current occupants who would view your presence as either a scouting mission for invasion or an immediate threat requiring violent elimination. It was like trying to case a bank while the security guards were trained killers with a shoot-first policy and no interest in asking questions later. Reading territorial markers became a survival skill that required the analytical abilities of a forensic scientist combined with the stealth capabilities of a special forces operative. Every scent mark told a story about the creature who left it, their size, health status, recent hunting success, mating condition, and level of territorial aggression. Misinterpreting these chemical messages could send you stumbling into confrontations you weren't prepared to handle. The psychological warfare began long before any actual physical confrontation. Established territory holders would deliberately leave intimidating markers at the boundaries of their domains, essentially posting biological no trespassing signs that carried the implicit threat of violent enforcement. These weren't subtle suggestions, they were explicit promises of what would happen to intruders who ignored the warnings. Your own scent production during this phase created additional complications because territorial anxiety caused hormonal changes that altered your chemical signature in ways that advertised your insecurity and inexperience. You were essentially broadcasting your vulnerability to every predator in the area while trying to project an image of strength and confidence that your biology was actively undermining. The waiting game was psychologically devastating because patience was required in situations where every instinct screamed for immediate action. You might identify a potential territory and then spend weeks observing the current occupants' patterns, looking for signs of weakness, injury, or absence that could create an opportunity for challenge. These surveillance operations were exercises in controlled torture that tested your mental stability as much as your strategic thinking. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to territorial acquisition because seasonal changes could dramatically alter the value and defensibility of different locations. A prime fishing spot during dry season might become completely worthless during floods, while marginal areas could suddenly become highly desirable when water levels changed. Your territorial calculations had to account for variables that were completely unpredictable. The challenge protocols were unwritten rules that had to be learned through observation and potentially fatal trial and error. Different established predators had varying tolerance levels for territorial intrusion, with some launching immediate attacks, while others preferred extended intimidation campaigns designed to wear down challengers psychologically before resorting to physical violence. Direct confrontation was the nuclear option that most rational creatures tried to avoid, but eventually became inevitable when two predators decided the same territory was worth dying for. These weren't sporting competitions with rules and referees. They were no-holds-barred death matches where the loser might not survive to learn from their mistakes. The combat techniques required for territorial warfare were completely different from hunting skills, requiring a whole new set of abilities that had to be developed without access to practice partners or training facilities. Every fight was essentially a final exam in subjects you'd never been taught, with failure resulting in permanent expulsion from life itself. Size advantages weren't always decisive factors in territorial disputes because experience, technique, and pure desperation could level playing fields in unexpected ways. Smaller challengers who fought with the fury of creatures who had nothing left to lose sometimes overcame larger opponents who'd become complacent after years of successful territorial defense. The injury management during territorial conflicts was a strategic consideration that had to be balanced against the need to project strength and dominance. Showing weakness could invite additional challenges from opportunistic predators, but ignoring serious injuries could compromise future survival prospects. You had to calculate whether immediate medical attention was worth the risk of appearing vulnerable. Recovery periods following territorial battles created windows of vulnerability where other predators might attempt to claim disputed areas, while the victor was weakened from combat. Winning a territorial dispute was only the first step in a process that required sustained defensive capabilities over extended periods while healing from battle damage. The maintenance requirements for established territories were enormous and seemed designed to prevent any creature from enjoying the fruits of their violent labor. Constant patrolling was necessary to deter potential challengers, requiring energy expenditures that had to be balanced against hunting needs and recovery from previous conflicts. Boundary enforcement became a full-time occupation that interfered with every other aspect of survival. You couldn't focus entirely on hunting because territorial intrusions required immediate responses. You couldn't rest properly because challenges could occur at any time. You couldn't explore new areas because leaving your territory undefended invited immediate invasion attempts. The psychological pressure of territorial ownership was crushing because every day brought the possibility of challenges from younger, stronger, more desperate predators who viewed your territory as their ticket to survival. You were essentially living in a constant state of siege warfare where the enemy could attack from any direction at any moment. Seasonal territorial adjustments were necessary because environmental changes altered the value and boundaries of claimed areas. Water level fluctuations could submerge prime hunting spots or expose new fishing opportunities that triggered boundary disputes with neighboring territory holders. Your carefully established borders became meaningless when the landscape itself shifted. The social isolation of territorial ownership was absolutely devastating because successful territory holders became targets for every ambitious predator in the region. Your success made you a marked creature who couldn't form alliances or seek assistance without appearing weak and inviting challenges from former allies who might decide your territory looked appealing. Alliance formation was theoretically possible, but practically suicidal, because temporary partnerships created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by partners who decided to eliminate potential competition while appearing to cooperate. Trust was a luxury that territorial predators couldn't afford in an environment where betrayal was often the most profitable strategy. The resource management challenges were staggering because territorial ownership meant you were responsible for maximizing the productive capacity of your claimed area while simultaneously defending it from creatures who wanted to steal the results of your investment. You had to be simultaneously a resource manager, military commander, and apex predator. Hunting efficiency within established territories created strategic dilemmas because overharvesting could deplete fish populations and reduce the long-term value of your territorial investment. You had to practice sustainable hunting techniques while competing with poachers who had no interest in conservation and every incentive to strip your territory of resources. The breeding territory requirements were exponentially larger than subsistence territories because reproductive success required not just personal survival resources, but also space for courtship displays, nesting sites, and offspring development. Expanding territorial claims to accommodate breeding needs brought you into conflict with multiple established predators simultaneously. Mate attraction through territorial display was another full-time occupation that had to be balanced against defense, hunting, and maintenance responsibilities. Female Baryonyx evaluated potential mates based on territorial quality, which meant your real estate had to be impressive enough to justify the enormous costs of acquisition and maintenance. The seasonal mating aggregations created temporary territorial disruptions, where normal boundary agreements became meaningless as hormone-driven predators abandoned rational territorial behavior in favor of reproductive competition that often resulted in wholesale destruction of established hierarchies. Competition intensity during breeding season transformed relatively stable territorial arrangements into chaotic free-for-all battles, where established territory holders found themselves fighting simultaneous wars against multiple challengers who'd formed temporary alliances specifically to eliminate dominant individuals. The post-breeding territorial collapse was a predictable consequence of the energy expenditures required for reproductive behavior. Successful mating often left territory holders weakened and vulnerable to challenges from predators who deliberately avoided breeding in order to capitalize on the temporary weakness of their competitors. Inheritance protocols for territorial succession were non-existent because Baryonyx society had no mechanisms for peaceful transfer of territorial ownership. When established territory holders died, their domains became contested battlegrounds where multiple claimants fought wars of succession that often lasted longer than the original owner's tenure. The geographic expansion possibilities were limited by the fact that all desirable territories were already claimed by predators who'd invested significant time and energy into establishing their domains. Expansion meant either finding marginal areas that nobody else wanted or engaging in aggressive warfare against established neighbors who would fight to the death rather than surrender valuable real estate. Border disputes were constant sources of stress because territorial boundaries were fluid concepts that shifted based on seasonal conditions, resource availability, and the relative strength of adjacent territory holders. What belonged to you yesterday might be claimed by someone else today based on changes in circumstances that were beyond your control. The intelligence requirements for successful territorial management were enormous because you had to maintain detailed knowledge of every neighboring territory holder's capabilities, behavioral patterns, health status, and potential weaknesses, while simultaneously monitoring environmental conditions that could affect territorial values. Espionage activities became necessary survival skills because information about neighboring predators was crucial for making strategic decisions about when to challenge, when to defend, and when to retreat. You had to develop spy networks among neutral creatures while avoiding detection by counterintelligence operations conducted by territorial rivals. The diplomatic protocols for interterritorial relations were based entirely on threat assessment and power projection, because there were no peaceful conflict resolution mechanisms in Cretaceous politics. Every interaction with neighboring territory holders was essentially a military negotiation where the threat of violence was the only currency that carried any value. Trade relationships were impossible to establish because territorial predators viewed any resource sharing as potential weakness that could be exploited by partners who might decide to eliminate competition rather than maintain cooperative arrangements. Economic cooperation was a luxury that creatures living on the edge of survival couldn't afford to risk. The information warfare aspects of territorial competition involved deliberate misinformation campaigns designed to mislead rivals about your capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. Psychological operations became as important as physical prowess because convincing opponents that you were stronger than you actually were could prevent costly conflicts. Deception strategies required incredible sophistication because experienced territory holders had developed the ability to detect false displays of strength and would call bluffs by launching immediate attacks against predators who appeared to be projecting artificial confidence. The psychological games were as deadly as the physical confrontations. The technology gap between established territory holders and challengers was enormous because experienced predators had developed hunting techniques, defensive strategies, and territorial management systems that took years to perfect. You were essentially trying to compete with professionals while operating as a complete amateur. Innovation requirements for territorial success meant you had to develop new techniques that could overcome the established advantages of experienced territory holders. Simply copying existing strategies wasn't sufficient because established predators had already developed countermeasures for conventional approaches. The learning curve for territorial management was impossibly steep because mistakes had fatal consequences, and there were no opportunities for practice runs or training exercises. You had to master complex strategic thinking while simultaneously executing physical techniques that required perfect timing and coordination. Knowledge transfer between generations was impossible because territorial success required eliminating potential competitors, including offspring who might eventually challenge parental territories. The most successful predators were essentially required to ensure that their children never learned enough to threaten their dominance. The equipment maintenance requirements for territorial warfare meant your claws, teeth, and physical conditioning had to be maintained at peak performance levels continuously, because challenges could occur without warning. You were essentially maintaining military hardware while using it constantly for both combat and hunting purposes. Physical conditioning for territorial defense required training regimens that had to be balanced against hunting needs and energy conservation requirements. You needed to maintain peak combat readiness while avoiding the caloric expenditures that could compromise your nutritional status and make you vulnerable to challenges from better-fed opponents. The tactical planning required for territorial defense was incredibly sophisticated because you had to prepare for multiple scenarios involving different types of challengers with varying capabilities and strategic approaches. Your defensive preparations had to account for direct assault, siege warfare, guerrilla tactics, and psychological operations simultaneously. Strategic reserves became crucial considerations because territorial conflicts often required sustained combat over extended periods. You needed to maintain energy reserves for prolonged battles while also ensuring adequate resources for recovery periods and ongoing territorial maintenance responsibilities. So there you have it. Being born as a Baryonyx was essentially nature's cruelest joke, a biological nightmare disguised as an evolutionary experiment. From your first gasping breath to your inevitable violent end, every moment was a desperate struggle against impossible odds in a world designed to kill you. Yet somehow, through sheer brutality and luck, a few managed to survive and pass on this legacy of suffering to the next generation.